Squash plants are not easy to grow in this cool maritime climate. With some extra protection in the spring and the right variety, and if we get some good weather in the summer, I have been able to get a good crop of squash, at least in the larger patches of ground. I have been trying additional varieties, hoping to find some that will also produce well in this context, so that we can have different types of squash to eat. These trials have not been overly successful, partially because I've been mixing varieties that grow very differently. This year I tried segregating the more vigorous vining varieties from the more compact bush varieties. This produced some better results and I learned some interesting things, but overall it wasn't a great year for this crop. In the wet climate of Ireland, there is a general lack of warm weather that these types of plants need to produce well, and we often get a lot of wind that can damage the large leaves. There is also a risk of a late frost that can kill off the young plants, or an early frost that can cut the season short in the autumn. I generally provide extra protection to help the plants get established in the spring. And once the plants get too big to be covered and the flowers need to be pollinated, the plants need to face whatever weather conditions we end up getting. I have had fairly good success with one hybrid variety called Crown Prince, which I've grown for years. It produces a good yield of medium-sized squash that have gray skins and a thick, dense orange flesh that can be really tasty. But I have wanted to find different types of squash that will have different uses in the kitchen and will also grow well in this climate. I have been growing a range of different varieties of winter squash and pumpkins for the past few years. I still haven't found a variety that can consistently produce as well as a Crown Prince variety, and have only had partial success in finding decent varieties that will expand the range of tastes, textures, and uses in the kitchen. But these trials have been compromised for a few reasons, including some varieties that I planted being much larger and more aggressive plants that tend to take over the space and crowd out the smaller and less vigorous varieties. So this is not really a great evaluation of either the smaller or the larger plants. I noticed this last year in a trial of 30 different varieties in one of the polytunnels, where the vines from some of the plants were very long, colonizing the space that should have been available for other varieties. In the large bed of the simple garden last year, the 5 bush or non-vining squash plants that I planted in the middle of the bed were almost lost among the much more vigorous growth of the 2 vining varieties planted on either side. The 3 vining plants ended up producing a lot of squash with so much extra space to take over, but the non-vining bush plants barely produced anything, and the overall yield was lower than previous years. And a similar thing happened in the other gardens, where the bush variety of squash really struggled when sharing the smaller bed with the 2 vining varieties. I realized that if I'm going to be growing several different varieties of squash, I need to pay closer attention to the size the plants will actually grow to, something that wasn't so important when I was growing only one variety of squash. And I figured it would be better to segregate the non-vining bush varieties from the ones that send out much longer vines, and to plant them closer or farther apart in a bed to give them different amounts of space depending on how large they are expected to grow. Of course, this makes sense in hindsight, but it's not something that I really considered when planting out all the varieties in the trials, or when selecting a few varieties to grow beside each other in the smaller gardens. With the variety trials that I've done with the other vegetable crops, the differences in size or vigor was much less of a factor. But with the squash plants, this difference in size really compromised the results, so I should probably do the trials again. I only grew 6 varieties of winter squash this past year. I grew the 2 vining varieties that I'd grown last year in the large bed of the simple garden. With 8 vining plants able to grow into 30 square meters of space, this was almost 4 square meters for each plant. I grew 4 bush or non-vining varieties in the smaller beds of the other gardens, planted them closer together, squished in between the other crops. In each of the other gardens, there was a different number of squash plants and a different spacing. But I figured that there was between 3 and 5 of these non-vining bush plants growing in the amount of space that was available for one of the larger vining plants in the simple garden. The bush varieties included an open pollinated variety and a hybrid variety that I've grown before, and 2 new hybrid varieties that I haven't grown before, one curry type and a Hokkaido type of squash. I have found that there's not a lot of options for winter squash varieties that have a bush habit, and it seems that most of them are hybrid varieties, which I guess makes sense. The vining plants in the simple garden grew as expected. They seemed to be slower to get established than in previous years, but the vines eventually did grow to fill out most of the space. Some of the flowers appeared closer to the center of the plant, but as usual, most of them ended up appearing on the longer vines, which helped to spread the squash out over a lot of the bed. The 4 varieties of bush squash plants did stay quite compact, at least for the first part of the season. They looked a lot like a courgette or zucchini plant or other types of summer squash, with several shorter vines spreading out from the center, and with reduced spacing between the leaves on each vine. This produced quite a dense core of the plant where the majority of the male and female flowers appeared. With some of the varieties, the mature squash that ended up growing were located quite close to the base of the plant stem, right within the center of the plant. Other varieties produced squash further out on the vines that had started to spread out later in the season. I had initially thought of pruning off these longer vines to maintain a more compact plant, but in some cases this could have removed the only squash that eventually developed. I thought this was quite interesting, as earlier in the season there were lots of flowers and immature fruit within the center of the plants for all of the varieties. There were also lots of female flowers and immature fruit compared to the limited number of squash that ended up being produced. In some cases, all of the female flowers that appeared at the center of the plant failed, and it was only the female flowers that appeared later on the longer vines that ended up becoming squash, and this may have been why the plants produced these longer vines in the first place. It seems that lack of pollination was an issue. I did see bumblebees and honeybees at the flowers, but perhaps not so regularly or enough of them. Another potential factor was that there was 2 different species of squash, which apparently cannot cross-pollinate, with 2 Pepo varieties and 2 Maxima varieties. There was also an issue of male and female flowers not appearing on the same plant at the same time, something that I've seen with courgettes or zucchini plants. So there was only a few plants of each species, and the flowers were only open for a day. So there could have been many days when there was either no male flowers with suitable pollen or no female flowers open for the bees to carry the pollen to. Assuming that there was any pollinators around at the time to transport the pollen. In a larger patch of squash, with many more plants of the same variety or species, there is a much greater chance of both compatible male and female flowers being open at the same time. But with fewer plants, this could delay any pollination, which could limit the amount of squash we end up getting, and potentially even change the way the plants grow. These non-vining squash plants in 2 of the gardens were also overshadowed by a double row of tall broad beans or fava bean plants on one side, and very vigorous potato plants on the other side. So for part of the season, there was less space, less sun, and more competition than I would have wanted for these plants, but also less wind. With the sheltered conditions and the abundant fertility that was in the soil, the squash plants grew fairly large and got too big for the space, especially in the intensive garden, which I contained with an open-top cold frame. The varieties in the middle of these beds were probably more affected by this competition, and possibly another reason why these particular plants produce fewer squash. Overall, these bush varieties didn't do as well as I had hoped, with both pollination and overcrowding being potential issues, but it was also not a great season for growing squash in general. I have 8 years of data growing the same squash in the simple garden in similar ways as part of a 3-year crop rotation, and this year was the lowest yield I have seen in that garden. It could be that there was less soil fertility this year, which can vary considerably with the sheet composting methods that I use in this garden, but the weather has also been cooler than usual. The monthly median temperature during the growth of these plants was lower this year than it was in the previous 3 years, and generally lower than the long-term average. For a lot of June and for the first part of July, the temperature was noticeably cooler than even the moderate summer weather that we usually expect. This was when these squash plants were becoming established, which would have slowed down their growth quite a bit, and possibly the most significant reason for the lower yields in this garden this year. And probably why the bush plants in the other gardens didn't do as well as I had hoped. We just didn't get the warm weather for a good crop of squash. Looking at the results of all of this, there was a lower yield in the simple garden than I've come to expect from these vining plants. The Crown Prince variety that have grown for years was disappointing this year, with fewer squash in each plant, but we still have a lot to eat. The Orange Hokkaido variety produced a lot less than I expected, especially after the huge crop from the same variety last year. I'm not sure if this was just a bad year for this variety, or if last year was an anomaly, or if this variety just needs a lot more space to do well. In the other gardens where I was growing the bush and non-vining varieties, the overall yield was not great, mainly because the 2 varieties in the middle of the bed produced so little. It might be time to give up trying to grow these 2 Pepo varieties, but perhaps they just need more space with less competition from other varieties, or just a warmer summer. The Hokkaido type of squash seemed to be most successful, with quite a few fruit on each of the small plants, but the squash were smaller than expected. The kabocha type plants had reasonable sized squash, but only 2 squash per plant, which was disappointing. I think these 2 Maxima varieties would be worth growing again, and it would be interesting to see how they would produce in better conditions. So overall, I was disappointed with the crop of squash this year, but I also learned a fair amount, and there are things I can change in the future even if I can't change the weather. There is a lot to consider with this type of plant that I didn't really appreciate when I was growing lots of plants of only one vining variety. The distance between the plants, or how much space each plant has to grow in, does depend on the variety, and for some of the more vigorous varieties, it seems that they can do better with a lot more space. But getting the biggest yield from an individual plant might not be as important as getting the biggest yield from a specific area with multiple plants, and I think there's a balance to be found there somewhere that seems to depend on the variety. The amount of fertility that is available is also a factor, and of course the weather will change how big the plants will grow. Even the bush or non-vining varieties seem to do better with more space, and there seems to be a false economy trying to fit more plants into a small space. Growing several varieties in the same space has caused some issues with overcrowding, as well as possibly interfering with pollination. Having a sufficient number of plants close to each other that are all flowering at the same time increases the chance of a female flower getting delivery of the right kind of pollen. So, growing multiple plants of the same variety in the same space would probably be more successful than mixing varieties, which is what I have been doing. Of course, I'm going to be changing things next year, making sure that individual varieties are segregated, not just separating the bush plants from the vining ones as I did this year. I'm also interested in trying out more varieties again, because I don't really trust the results of the previous trials that I've done. But if I need to grow multiple plants of each variety to properly evaluate them, this is going to take up a lot more space. I would also like to explore actively pruning the squash plants, which is something that I regularly do with other plants such as tomatoes, cucumbers, or even courgette or zucchini plants. I wonder if appropriate pruning of the vines and the side shoots of the squash plants would help to encourage these plants to focus on ripening the existing fruit rather than growing some more, and potentially reducing the overcrowding of other plants. And removing some of the leaves could let more sun in to warm the developing squash, which could apparently help them ripen. This more active approach to managing these squash plants is a change from the usual approach that I take of just letting things grow, perhaps pushing them back at the edges when they do overgrow a bit, and just accepting whatever is produced. This hands-off method works quite well if there is a lot of space. But if I want to get a bigger crop of better quality squash in the smaller space, more care and attention is probably useful, and growing the right variety, at least in this context.